August 1999, on a humid Monday outside Moberly, Missouri, Hank Jennings rolled his 1979 Chevrolet C20 into the Route Z co-op lot and parked between two new diesel pickups that still had temporary tags. His truck had rust lifting from both fenders, a cracked bench seat taped at the seam, and an odometer that had turned past 318,000 miles. He wore faded overalls with a stitched knee patch and a brown coat whose zipper had been replaced by hand. Men who had known him for years still glanced at him the same way, quick and confident, the way people look at somebody they assume got left behind. The visual contrast did the talking before anyone did. One neighbor stepped down from a finance crew cab with chrome running boards and a 7-year note folded into his operating line. Another had just closed a second mortgage at 7.8% to add bins and what he called efficiency. Hank carried a coffee thermos and a folded parts list. By 43, he already owned 260 acres free and clear, leased another 190, and had no liens on his machinery, his grain storage, or his house. The truck had cost him $2,200 cash from a widow in Clark County. He had kept every receipt since. Dustin Kroll arrived 10 minutes later in a polished black pickup from Kroll Ag Systems, logo bright on both doors, dealer plate frame shining in the sun. He was charismatic, sharp, and very good at the room. Pressed shirt, clean boots, perfect timing. He shook hands fast, laughed loud, and sold certainty in monthly payment form. When somebody asked whether old equipment could still carry a modern farm, Dustin tipped his head toward Hank and said, with a smile meant to land as humor, "That strategy works until one major breakdown invoice decides your future for you." Several men laughed. Hank did not answer. He only asked the co-op manager whether 15W40 was still on the pallet discount. Silence was part of his method long before it was part of his reputation. Hank had learned debt math early and at close range. In 1985, when he was 29, he stood beside a fence line with his father and watched auction flags whip in March wind at the Brower place 3 miles east. Leon Brower had not been careless, and that mattered to Hank for the rest of his life. Leon had borrowed when everyone said borrow, expanded when everyone said scale, and carried variable rates that moved from manageable to punishing faster than his corn checks could adjust. The farm did not fail from laziness. It failed from timing, leverage, and compounding interest. That sequence lodged in Hank like gravel under skin. He did not become wealthy in one decision. He built a framework and then repeated it for 20 years. No land bought on borrowed money, no machine purchased because of pride, no household inflation in good years. Cash reserves first, expansion second. By the second week of September 1986, he had written those rules on an index card and tucked it behind the plastic cover of a farm ledger book he used until the corners rounded smooth. He started with $14,300 saved from welding nights, custom hay work, and one old grain truck he rebuilt with a transmission pulled from a salvage yard. A retired farmer named Wilbur Sykes leased him 52 acres at $68 per acre on a handshake and one line that Hank repeated later to younger farmers. "Pay me when the crop pays you." Hank paid on time and then early. The numbers from those years were not glamorous, but they were precise. 1986, leased 52 acres, gross income $61,440, net $11,220 after fuel, seed, rent, and taxes. 1987, leased 80 acres total, gross $88,300, net $18,040. Bought a used 1968 John Deere 4020 at auction for $8,900 cash. 1988, gross $102,700, net $24,500. Built emergency reserve to $31,000. 1989, bought first 40 acres at $1,050 per acre, total $42,000. Paid cash from reserve plus grain sales. 1990, drought pressure, gross down to $79,600. Net still positive at $9,100 because no term payments. The progression continued exactly the same way, one unremarkable year at a time. 1991, replaced worn planter chains and rebuilt the hydraulic pump for $1,340 instead of financing new iron at $28,000. 1992, added 35 acres at $1,180 per acre, total $41,300 cash. 1993, flood year losses cut yield, still avoided red ink by reducing household withdrawals to $21,900. 1994, gross $154,000, net $37,400, reserve rebuilt to $58,600. 1995, bought another 60 acres at $1,450 per acre, total $87,000 cash, then delayed any machinery purchase for 19 months. By 1997, he was farming 390 acres total between owned and leased ground, still driving whatever truck would start in winter, still patching jackets instead of replacing them. His annual household cap settled at $28,400 and stayed there even when grain years were strong. Property tax and insurance averaged $8,940. Utilities and fuel, $5,460. Groceries, $6,780. Clothing, $620. Medical and dental, $2,110. Church and community giving, $1,400. Miscellaneous and repairs, $3,090. Total, $28,400. In years when farm net crossed $80,000, the difference went to reserves, land envelopes, and short municipal bonds purchased through a local advisor who respected two instructions: no leverage, no surprises. People around him did not see that ledger. They saw dust on the truck hood and cuffs frayed at the wrist. They saw a man who would rather spend a Saturday rebuilding a feeder house bearing than signing dealer paperwork in air conditioning. They mistook refusal for inability. The routine that built his position looked almost boring from the road. In February 2001, he stood at a consignment auction 40 miles south and bought a gravity wagon for $1,050, a grain drill for $375, and a parts combine with a sound unloading auger for $2,800. He paid in cashier checks already prepared in labeled envelopes so he did not overbid. In April, he replaced 2 hydraulic lines and a water pump on the 4020 for $642 total, while neighbors took delivery of tractors with touchscreen displays and monthly notes that exceeded his annual repair budget in less than 5 months. From 2002 through 2005, he repeated the same operating cadence. Lease only what he could plant on time with current labor. Pre-buy fertilizer when seasonal price spreads gave at least 8% savings. Sell grain in disciplined increments, never all at harvest lows. Keep 1 year of household expenses in liquid cash and 1 year of core input costs in reserve. In 2003, when corn averaged weak and weather-clipped yield, his gross fell to $286,000 and net to $43,000. He still made no late payments because there were no loan payments to make. In 2004, gross rose to $349,000, net to $66,000, and he moved $50,000 to a land fund rather than upgrading his pickup. In 2005, he bought 2 steel bins from a retirement sale for $18,400 total and spent $9,700 installing them with local labor, less than half the quoted finance package from a regional dealer. To Hank, Dustin's polished certainty and constant payment talk looked like a sales logic built for momentum, one phase of a farm cycle, measured in signatures and monthly notes. Hank read him as smart, disciplined, and pointed in a different direction than his own. The numbers around them seemed to validate nearly everyone for a while. The tension sat there for years, quiet but growing, because commodity prices can flatter almost any strategy for a while. By the end of 2005, that tension was close to leaving coffee counter talk and entering courthouse records. In early 2006, one auction notice would force appearance and arithmetic into the same public frame, and the oldest truck in the lot would become the least important number attached to Hank Jennings. The auction notice was taped crooked on the co-op corkboard, one thumbtack bent, paper curling at the corner from damp air drifting in every time the front door opened. Hank read it once, then read the lender details again, not because he was surprised, but because he always traced who held the paper. First Prairie Bank, equipment collateral cross-linked with land equity, sale date posted for the 3rd Saturday in March. Outside, his 1979 Chevrolet C20 sat under a powder of road dust, rust along both wheel wells darkened by last night's rain. A teenager hauling feed nodded toward it and asked whose truck it was. When he heard it was Hank's, he said, "That old thing still runs?" Hank said, "Every day," and folded the notice into his coat pocket. 3 days later, Kroll Ag Systems hosted its spring open house with grilled burgers, financing banners, and a line of polished machinery parked at angles designed for photographs. Dustin Kroll moved through the crowd like he owned the weather. He wore a pressed blue shirt with his name stitched above the pocket, a bright belt buckle, and boots clean enough to reflect showroom lights. First Prairie had set up a lending table under a white tent, with rate cards clipped to acrylic stands and coffee in branded cups. The offer was simple on paper and expensive in structure. Roll existing obligations into one package, add a combine and 2 tractors, lock 2.9% for 24 months, then reset to prime plus 3.25%. On the day they presented it, projected corn sat at $4.35 per bushel, and everyone in line used that number like it was guaranteed. Dustin spotted Hank near the parts counter and turned the moment into a performance. He glanced toward the C20 in the gravel row and said, loud enough for 3 circles of people to hear, "Nostalgia is not a financing strategy, Hank." A few men laughed. A banker smiled into his cup. Dustin pulled a folder from under his arm and laid out the numbers with each salesman precision. Package total, $540,000. Initial monthly payment, $3,884 before reset. At prime rising to 6.75%. Projected payment after month 24, $5,417. If prime hit 7.50%, payment moved to $5,748. He pointed to yield tables, acreage assumptions, and tax treatment footnotes. The structure was clean. The risk sat in the futures. Hank looked at the sheet, asked for the reset formula twice, and handed it back. "No debt," he said. 4 words. Dustin gave him one more pass, this time with urgency language and the practiced concern of somebody selling protection. "You are one major repair away from losing a season. Borrow cheap while cheap is available. Hank thanked him, bought 2 belts and a filter set for $186.40 and walked out. Before this moves any further, if you want to track who survives when rates rise and grain turns against projections, stay with every number because the ending depends on arithmetic, not personality. The next Tuesday, Hank met Earl Timmons at a kitchen table with a heat ring burned into the varnish from decades of coffee mugs. Earl was retiring at 72 and selling an adjacent 80 acres that touched Hank's north fence line. Asking price was $196,000, or $2,450 per acre, with possession after wheat stubble. 2 younger operators had offered letters of intent contingent on financing. Hank brought a cashier check and a 1-page purchase agreement. No contingency language, no bank timeline. Earl read it, pressed his thumb against the signature line as if measuring the moment, and said, "You are draining your cushion for this," Hank answered. "I keep enough to plant." He left that afternoon with a deed and less liquidity than he had carried in 15 years. That decision looked reckless to people who measured safety by unused credit. Hank measured safety by fixed obligations in bad years. The distinction mattered more than anyone admitted in public. At home, he opened the Green Ledger, wrote 2006 land purchase, 80 acres, $196,000 cash, and drew a line under remaining liquid reserves, $142,700. Then he added input reserve, $118,400 already staged in fertilizer prebuys, seed contracts, and diesel storage. Household reserves stayed untouched at $28,400, 1 full year by his own rule. He knew the position was tighter than he liked. He also knew an adjustable note would have made it fragile instead of tight. He had learned that difference slowly, through losses that did not all belong to him. In 1992, when he was building acreage in 30 and 40-acre steps, his neighbor Harold Pruitt financed a new tractor and planter package for $126,000 at 8.1%, because dealer rebates made the monthly payment appear manageable against then-current prices. Harold was a careful operator and a decent man. 2 weak seasons later, input costs climbed, basis widened at harvest, and the payment that had looked like progress became a monthly emergency. Hank helped him pull a transmission one November night in an unheated shop while Harold ran numbers on a legal pad and said, without anger, "I am working for the note now." Harold sold rented ground first, then machinery, then 60 owned acres. He did not fail from character. He failed from leveraged timing. In 1998, a hog producer named Martin Clary expanded barns with a $310,000 variable loan when feed costs looked stable. They did not stay stable. By 2001, Martin was current but hollowed out, delaying repairs, skipping health insurance, patching fans with wire because principal and interest took priority over maintenance. Hank watched that trade-off happen in real time and wrote a private rule in the margin of his ledger. Do not let debt decide maintenance. Maintenance decides yields. It sounded plain. It saved him money for 20 years. His own discipline had been less dramatic but relentless. He priced every major purchase against a repair-first alternative. New grain drill quoted at $23,800 with financing. Used drill plus bearings, opener discs, and paint, $2,140 total, cash. New combine header trailer package, $14,900 financed. Salvage frame and weld work, $1,180 cash. In 2004, a dealer proposed replacing his primary tractor with a late model unit at $78,000 and structured payments around tax depreciation. Hank rebuilt injectors, replaced hoses, and installed 2 rear tires for $4,960. The tractor stayed in service. Money stayed in reserve. Pride stayed out of the transaction. By the first week of May 2006, planting started under clear skies and low wind, and Route Z split into 2 philosophies running the same roads. Several neighbors had signed Dustin's package or variants of it, often with land equity folded into machinery financing to improve front-end cash flow. The spreadsheets looked clean in spring. Hank ran older equipment and accepted slower acres per day capacity, but his fixed annual obligations remained property taxes, insurance, and living costs. No machinery note, no term land payment, no cross-collateral trigger. Dustin's models still looked stronger on speed and optics. Caleb Morris, younger and aggressive, financed expansion that season and put in long days with equipment that could cover a field before weather shifted. Lena and Roy Whitfield took a second mortgage to add bins and secure operating flexibility. Tomas Vega signed for dairy retrofits to reduce labor pressure and improve throughput. None of them were foolish. They were competent people making decisions from the prevailing consensus that scale would outrun cost. For a while, it often did. Hank kept operating in quiet routines that did not photograph well. He greased fittings before dawn, tracked fuel burn by field, and ran maintenance intervals like clockwork instead of crisis response. He bought parts in winter when suppliers discounted older inventory. He paid custom trucking only when his own bins were full and basis improved enough to justify timing. He capped household spending even when checks were good, and in June he repaired the C20 brake lines himself for $94.75 in parts rather than replacing the truck. He logged mileage at 326,412 and wrote one line beside it, "Still cheaper than payments." The people closest to him understood this was not stubbornness for its own sake. It was a full system. He separated identity from equipment age, cash flow from ego, and expansion from excitement. On Sunday evenings, he reconciled 3 columns in the ledger: cash available, obligations due, and downside scenario at lower price assumptions. He never used the optimistic column as his operating plan. In his downside case for corn, he modeled $3.40, then $3.10, then $2.90. Not because he predicted collapse, but because he had seen what confidence did to men who never priced a hard year before it arrived. Summer moved in heavy and green, and comments around the county stayed mostly the same. Hank was called cautious, outdated, too conservative to seize opportunity. Dustin kept saying old iron and no leverage was a dead-end strategy in a modern market. Hank did not argue in public. He changed a feeder chain, patched a bin fan housing, and stacked working capital. By late October 2006, harvest tickets and payment books were telling 2 different stories beneath one strong season. Farms carrying new notes looked prosperous, and many were, but they now depended on prices, rates, and weather holding in sequence. Hank's books showed lower top-end speed and higher retained control. Gross did not settle arguments at coffee counters. Net after obligations did, but net was private until crisis made it public. That winter, he added one more line to his index card rules and copied it into fresh ink so he could read it in dim shop light. Liquidity is not idle when volatility is certain. It was the plainest sentence on the card, and the one most people around him still treated as fear. 2 months later, as lenders began repricing operating lines and early input invoices came in higher than forecast, The county discovered how fast a teaser rate can turn from advantage to pressure when prime moves the wrong direction. Hank's old truck kept turning into co-op lots, courthouse parking spaces, and sale barns, rust and all, while the numbers he had protected for 20 years prepared to do what speeches never could. 2 months later meant loan renewal month, and in farm country that was when optimism met paper. At First Prairie Bank, renewals that had floated in the 5s came back in the 7s, and several operating lines were repriced with floor clauses most borrowers had skimmed past in earlier meetings. Hank sat at his kitchen table on a rainy Tuesday in January 2007, spread his ledger beside a yellow legal pad, and recalculated break-even with corn at $3.35, then $3.10, then $2.95. He kept the same conclusion each time. If obligations stay low enough, volatility hurts but does not decide ownership. His 2007 books opened with 340 owned acres and 190 leased, 530 total in rotation. He planted 312 acres of corn and 218 acres of soybeans, with fertilizer bought in 2 tranches to avoid spring spikes. Diesel averaged $2.64 per gallon on his contracts. Seed and chemical cost $126,440 total. Repairs $11,980 through harvest, and crop insurance premiums $18,230. Gross farm income closed at $412,000, almost exactly where he had projected in February. Net after all farm expenses, taxes, and household draw was $71,000. He moved $40,000 to municipal bonds yielding 4.2%, kept $58,000 in immediate operating cash, and left the rest in a land envelope marked only with a date. By the first week of October 2007, neighbors still called him conservative, like it was a diagnosis. Dustin called him worse in private, though never where Hank cared to hear it. Kroll Ag Systems moved inventory quickly that year because the numbers still supported speed. Caleb Morris signed land and machinery packages totaling $1,180,000, combining a 20-year real estate note with shorter equipment paper and a variable operating line that gave him room to run bigger acres. Lena and Roy Whitfield drew a $410,000 second mortgage at a variable starting rate, using proceeds for storage, drainage work, and 2 newer tractors. Thomas Vega financed a $920,000 dairy retrofit, built around labor savings and throughput assumptions that looked sound on the consultant's model. Hank entered 2008 with no term debt, no machinery note, and enough reserve to prepay part of his spring inputs. He grossed $438,000 that year and netted $84,000 after an unplanned unloading auger, rebuild, and higher chemical bills. He bought a used tandem grain truck for $6,800 cash from a contractor in Macon County, spent $2,140 on brake work and tires, and put it into harvest duty instead of hiring extra haul-out runs. He also purchased 12 months of municipal issues in 2 blocks, $25,000 and $30,000, both laddered so maturities matched his seasonal cash trough. His rule held: liquidity first, then expansion, never the reverse. In 2009, weather stripped the county down to arithmetic. Rain failed in June and July, corn rolled early, and soybean pods came light. Hank's gross dropped to $301,000, and his net compressed to $39,000, but positive stayed positive because his fixed commitments stayed narrow. Repairs reached $14,600 exactly, including feeder house chain replacement and a late-season hydraulic pump. He delayed non-essential upgrades, sold grain in measured increments rather than panic loads, and kept household spending at $28,400, not a dollar more. Around him, people with similar yields and stronger equipment posted losses because monthly obligations were larger than their margin in a short crop. By mid-March 2010, Hank was tracking 3 lines every Sunday night: cash on hand, input coverage, and downside survival months. That season, he grossed $356,400 and netted $58,900, then used $49,500 to buy a 24-row planter from a retirement auction, plus parts and labor to recondition it over winter. Dealer equivalent for similar capacity sat above $182,000 with financing. His out-of-pocket after repairs was $53,870. He wrote one note in the margin: capacity gained, no payment gained. It was a small sentence carrying a very large difference. His ledger from 2011 through 2013 read like a metronome under stress. 2011, gross $394,200, net $67,300. Purchased no major iron. Increased liquid reserve by $46,000. 2012 drought again. Gross $327,600, net $42,800. Cut discretionary farm spending by $17,400 and still met all obligations. 2013, gross $341,900, net $44,200. Operating costs rose while grain softened, so he sold one underused tillage tool for $8,200 and kept his cash conversion cycle short. Across those 3 seasons, his average annual net was $51,433, and his average annual debt service was 0. That is why his bad years bent and did not break. The contrast with his peers was not about intelligence, it was about structure. Caleb's expansion gave him scale, but it also chained him to timing. His blended monthly obligations climbed until they reached $12,940 when variable components repriced and machinery terms rolled from teaser into full amortization. Even with competent yields, his contribution margin could not absorb rate shocks and lower grain at the same time. He sold a newer sprayer first, then a grain cart, then gave up leased acres to reduce input exposure. He worked harder each year and owned less control each year, a pattern that wore him down more than any single season. Lena and Roy Whitfield faced a different version of the same trap. Their second mortgage had looked manageable, while rates stayed tame and corn stayed strong. When the variable leg reset upward, their payment rose by $1,870 per month. That increase did not come with any extra bushels. Roy took winter welding jobs in town to keep current. Lena managed books after midnight at the kitchen table, and neither complained publicly because pride had little to do with it. They were fighting math with labor, and labor has limits. They sold one tractor, deferred bin maintenance, and stretched vendor terms until suppliers required tighter windows. Tomas Vega's retrofit should have improved his operation over a full cycle, but he hit the cycle at the wrong point. Milk checks weakened, while feed and energy moved up, and his loan structure stepped from interest-heavy to principal-heavy just as margins narrowed. He sold herd replacements to cover one payment, then another, then missed 3 consecutive payments when a processor contract shifted volumes. He was not reckless. He was cornered. On a cold morning in November, he told Hank in the co-op parking lot, "I modernized into a squeeze." Hank nodded and said, "You still know your numbers." Keep that. By harvest 2013, Route Z had become a study in visible prosperity versus retained resilience. New pickups sat beside barns with fresh roofs and tighter cash. Hank still drove the C20, now above 350,000 miles, with rust now spreading around the tailgate seam. His combine ran older electronics and occasional temper, and once that fall, he lost half a day to a sensor failure that younger operators would have solved by replacement, not repair. But his books stayed under his control. No banker could accelerate his timeline. No reset clause could rewrite his winter. 3 days after New Year in 2014, corn print slipped under $3.60 in local conversations and then in signed contracts. At the same time, operating rates in the region pushed beyond 8% for borrowers with weaker collateral coverage. That pairing did the damage, lower top-line revenue, and higher financing costs simultaneously. Caleb tried restructuring and extended terms where lenders would allow it. Lena and Roy negotiated partial interest-only periods, buying months but not relief. Tomas sought bridge credit and received conditional offers tied to additional collateral he did not have. Dustin kept selling modernization packages, but his tone shifted from triumph to urgency as defaults started appearing in counties around them. In 2014, Hank grossed $333,800 and netted $47,100. In 2015, he grossed $318,500 and netted $34,600 after heavier repair work and weather delays. He was never untouched. Old machinery cost time, and delayed planting cost yield potential, and cash discipline required saying no when neighbors were trying to say yes to each other. Yet his downside model had been built for this exact shape of pain. No term debt meant no debt service spike. No second mortgage meant no home equity exposure to acreage stress. No finance pickup meant no monthly bleed disguised as convenience. He carried pressure, but he did not carry compounding pressure. By the second week of July 2015, courthouse postings in Randolph and neighboring counties had moved from occasional to routine. Caleb lost 160 acres through a forced sale and surrendered one late-model tractor package. He kept farming reduced ground under tighter terms and refused to quit, which mattered. Lena and Roy sold bins and a 90-acre tract to satisfy their variable exposure and protect their home place, then rebuilt around 110 workable acres with strict cash budgeting. Thomas entered a supervised restructuring, downsized his herd, and renegotiated feed contracts to stabilize month-to-month cash flow. Each loss was specific. Each outcome came from numbers, not character. Hank did not celebrate any of it. He hauled parts to Caleb one evening and refused payment for the trip. He let Lena and Roy store grain briefly in one of his older bins when their logistics pinched. He connected Tomas with a feed broker who would write shorter contracts without predatory penalties. These were not grand gestures. They were practical bridges. Underneath them sat the same philosophy that had drawn ridicule a decade earlier. Own what you can hold through a bad sequence, then use the strength to keep other families from getting erased by one brutal cycle. Dustin watched this from the front of a model built on volume and finance turnover. He was still articulate, still persuasive, still not a villain in his own mind. He had followed a prevailing business script and sold it hard because for several years the script paid. But by late 2015, commission-rich years had turned into difficult conversations with borrowers who could not roll forward again. At one dealership meeting, when someone joked about old trucks and old farmers, Dustin did not laugh. He said, Cash flow does not care about appearances. Then moved to the next agenda item. Winter tightened the county further, and auctions multiplied. Hank attended with a folded bidder card, a thermos, and written ceilings he did not exceed. He watched repossessed machinery sell below replacement value and land parcels come through at discounts that had seemed unthinkable during the boom. He did not bid every sale. He waited for combinations that matched his reserves and his maintenance capacity. The patients looked cold from a distance, but up close it was disciplined triage. When March 2016 arrived, one courthouse list in particular drew nearly everyone who still believed the next decade would be written by whoever kept enough liquidity to act while others were forced to liquidate. Hank parked the old Chevrolet on the far edge of the lot, coat collar up against the wind, and walked toward a row of distressed assets, priced by pressure rather than pride. The first lot opened at 10:12 in a wind that cut through coat sleeves, and most bidders kept their hands in their pockets until the auctioneer reached the repossessed line. A used John Deere 9770 with 2,186 separator hours came up third. Paint faded on one panel, service records incomplete but mostly clean. Dustin stood near the clerk table with two lenders and a legal pad, expecting finance applications to follow each hammer drop. Hank stood 15 yards back, bidder card folded once, saying nothing. Bidding started at $118,000, moved in 5,000 steps, then slowed at $164,000 when two larger operators stopped. Hank lifted his card once at $166,000. Another bidder answered at $168,000. Hank went to $170,000 and held there while the ring men searched for one more hand. None came. Sold. He did not smile. He just wrote the lot number on a receipt envelope he had already labeled in blue ink. The two grain carts followed, each from a separate default file, each sold below what they had brought 3 years earlier. Hank bought the first for $24,000 and the second for $19,000, then passed on 3 lots he had not pre-priced for repairs. Near noon, the land tract came up. 120 acres split by a creek, mixed productivity, appraised during the boom at levels nobody in that crowd expected to see again soon. Opening bid was $420,000. It crawled to $458,000, stalled, and looked finished until Hank entered at $462,000. 2 bids later, the gavel fell at $471,000. 4 lots. Total commitment $684,000. All cash due by close of business. The clerk expected wire instructions. Dustin expected term sheets. Hank handed over 4 cashier checks from Monroe County Savings and 1 letter on bank letterhead, verifying immediately available funds of $1,982,440 in demand deposits and maturing municipal notes. The clerk read the figure twice, then checked signatures against identification with careful, slower hands. One lender asked whether the letter included encumbered collateral. It did not. Dustin asked for confirmation directly and called the issuing bank from the table, speaker volume low but still audible to the first row. The answer from the bank officer was brief and professional. Funds verified, checks good, no hold required. That was the moment the county stopped treating Hank's caution as personality and started treating it as balance sheet architecture. Men who had laughed at the truck looked at the truck again, then at the checks, then at each other. The 1979 Chevrolet sat by the fence with road salt on the rocker panels and 356,904 miles on the odometer, and it suddenly looked less like evidence of scarcity and more like evidence of a system that had worked exactly as designed. By the end of that week, Hank had moved the combine to his yard, logged immediate repair priorities at $12,840, and drafted a single-page policy he had never needed before. It was titled Clear Title Transition Terms. No interest, principal first. Written budget required. Quarterly review. Default converted to labor exchange before repossession. He showed it to his attorney, paid $640 to formalize template contracts, and filed copies in a metal cabinet beside crop insurance records. Let me stop here and ask you something. When a cycle turns against nearly everyone, do you optimize for appearances or for staying power? If this arithmetic sharpens how you think about risk, stay with the story, because this is where private discipline turns into community structure. Caleb Morris came first, not because he wanted charity, but because he wanted one season without predatory rollover terms. His remaining operation had good soil and disciplined labor, but his equipment bottleneck was costing yield at harvest. Hank first placed the 9770 with Caleb on an at-cost use arrangement, fuel and routine maintenance only, no markup, written logs required, then converted that access phase into a 5-year, zero-interest purchase contract once Caleb met the first-season cash flow checkpoints. Purchase basis for Caleb, $86,000, reflecting auction cost allocation plus a share of repairs, payable at $17,200 per year, due after crop settlement each December. Additional clause, Caleb had to keep debt service ratio under 20% and submit monthly cash flow statements from March through November. Fuel and routine maintenance stayed Caleb's responsibility. Catastrophic repair above $9,000 required joint approval before work. Caleb read every line, asked for 1 day, then signed. In year 1, he paid $17,200 on schedule and reduced custom harvest expense by $26,400. Net effect after added maintenance was a positive $19,100 to his operating margin. In year 2, with better timing and less field loss, he posted an additional $23,700 improvement over his prior 3-year average. Nothing about that was flashy. It was simply what happens when capital cost stops compounding against thin margins. Lena and Roy Whitfield asked for land access, not machinery. Their home place was intact, but their post-restructure acreage left them subscale for rotation efficiency. Hank had acquired a 40-acre parcel on the edge of his new tract with weak drainage but workable upside after tile repair. Market comps were running near $4,450 per acre. He sold to Lena and Roy at $3,100 per acre, total $124,000, on an 8-year zero-interest note with equal annual principal payments of $15,500. 2 conditions sat in the contract. They had to eliminate variable rate exposure within 24 months, and they had to build a 6-month household reserve before any non-essential capital purchase. They accepted both conditions. Roy took 2 more winters of fabrication work. Lena tightened their expense calendar to weekly cash envelopes, and by the 3rd year they had removed every variable rate clause from their books. The lower land basis and fixed principal schedule saved them roughly $62,000 versus prevailing financing offers over the same term. More important, they got predictability back. Predictability is what lets a farm plan instead of react. Tomas Vega's need was immediate liquidity, not long-term expansion. Feed invoices were outrunning milk checks during a contract transition, and 1 bad month was about to become 3. Hank wired $60,000 through a zero-interest bridge note. 5-year maximum term, first 6 months interest only set to 0 by definition, then principal at $1,000 per month minimum with flexibility to prepay in stronger quarters. The rule was printed in bold near the signature line. Pay down principal before any herd growth spending. Tomas agreed. He used $41,300 for feed, $11,900 for utility arrears and refrigeration maintenance, and kept $6,800 as cash buffer. By November of the first year, his processor contract stabilized volume, and he increased payments voluntarily to $1,800 per month. In 31 months, he had repaid the full $60,000. He sent Hank a final check with no note attached, which was exactly how Hank preferred it. 3 days after Tomas closed the bridge note, Hank added 2 younger operators most people in town barely noticed. Aaron Dahl, 27, needed a planter overhaul and had been quoted financing that would have added $1,140 monthly for 7 years. Hank structured a $28,500 parts and labor advance at 0 interest over 30 months, $950 principal each month, and required her to keep 1/4 seed cost in reserve at all times. Micah Sloan, 29, needed grain drying upgrades and faced a high-rate equipment lease. Hank funded $34,000 on a 4-year principal-only schedule. Both paid on time through the first 2 years and expanded cautiously, without taking second mortgages. By late harvest, 2018, the pattern was visible enough that even skeptics stopped calling it luck. Hank was not handing out gifts without rules. He was replacing compounding interest with enforced discipline and transparent terms. He had turned one balance sheet into a shock absorber for 5 nearby operations. The social effect was quiet but real. Fewer distress sales, fewer emergency refinancing meetings, fewer family decisions made at midnight under panic. The deeper examination sat in Hank's ledgers, and the numbers hold up under scrutiny. 2016, cash outflow $684,000 at auction, plus $12,840 repairs, plus $640 legal templates. Farm gross $352,700, net $49,300. Ending liquid reserves after transactions and bond maturities, $1,241,900. 2017, gross $367,400. Net $57,800. Principal received from assisted contracts $50,500. New assistants issued $88,500. Ending liquid reserves $1,196,700. 2018, gross $389,100, net $63,200. Principal received $78,100. Assistants issued $34,000. Ending liquid reserves $1,287,400. 2019 tightened margins countywide with softer basis and higher input cost. Hank grossed $361,600 and netted $46,900, while principal received from contracts reached $94,300, lifting liquidity despite lower operating profit. 2020 brought logistical volatility, but stronger selective pricing windows. His gross reached $418,500, net $82,600, and assisted operators collectively repaid $21,400 in principal. At that point, Hank's outstanding assistance balance had fallen below $140,000, while all 5 recipient operations remained active. Default counts stayed at 0 because he had screened for budgeting behavior, not optimism. If the county had followed conventional rates on those same assistance amounts, the arithmetic would have looked very different. Caleb's $86,000 at 8.4% over 5 years would have carried a monthly payment near $1,764 and total interest around $19,840. Lena and Roy's $124,000 at 7.9% over 8 years would have cost about $34,000 in interest. Thomas's $60,000 working bridge at 9.1% over 5 years would have added roughly $14,800. Aaron's and Micah's combined $62,500 at rates between 8.2 and 10.6% would have added about $13,900 more. Combined avoided interest across the 5 files, approximately $82,540, and that estimate stays conservative because it excludes renewal fees, late penalties, and repricing risk during volatile quarters. By the first week of January 2021, Hank formalized the process in a separate worksheet labeled Multiplier Ledger. It tracked one simple question. What does one cash purchase do after it is redeployed through disciplined terms? The 2016 auction outlay had secured his own operation first, then generated principal recycling that supported others, then preserved acreage in production that otherwise might have been fragmented or liquidated under stress. Across 5 recipient farms, 634 acres remained in family operation through that period, with estimated land value around $2,880,000 at local averages. That is the multiplier he cared about. Not applause, continuity. Dustin saw the same numbers from a different angle. His old model made strongest money when customers borrowed at scale into optimistic cycles. Hank's model made strongest community outcomes when borrowing costs were stripped out and standards were tightened. Those frameworks were on a collision path again by 2021 as supply chains snarled and machinery quotes climbed into double-digit financing territory. Everybody in Randolph County could feel another public test approaching, and this time nobody was looking at Hank's coat when they asked what he would do next. They were looking at his ledgers. By the 3rd week of September 2021, phone calls that once went to lenders started going to Hank's kitchen line, and he answered most of them after evening chores with the same legal pad open to the same 3 questions: what is owed, what is fixed, and what can be cut without harming next year's yield. That discipline carried straight into October, when the argument that had followed him since the co-op parking lot in 1999 finally moved into one room with everybody watching. The public collision with Dustin arrived in October 2021, exactly where everyone expected, at Kroll Ag Systems under banners promising modernization or extinction. Supply shortages had pushed machinery quotes up. Lenders were floating rates near 11.2% for weaker files, and Dustin tried to hold the county's attention with confidence and volume. He did what he had always done well: urgency, polish, momentum. Hank arrived late, boots muddy, coat faded, no performance in it. He asked for the distressed used inventory list and the 2 short-term notes linked to family farms in immediate default danger. Total package, $2,430,000. He asked for verified payoff letters, then wrote a cashier's check from Monroe County Savings in front of lenders, sales staff, and growers who had spent 15 years watching this argument unfold in pieces. Dustin called the bank to verify funds. The bank verified. No hold, no condition, no drama left to sell. Hank's terms were read aloud by his attorney 20 minutes later. Assets would be leased at cost. No compounding interest. Principal first schedules mandatory. Budget review required before delivery. The room went quiet because everyone in it understood what had just happened. Dustin had not been humiliated. He had been outstructured. 6 months later, after board pressure and shrinking margins on high-rate packages, he exited Kroll Ag Systems. He did not leave the industry. By 2024, he was consulting for 2 county dealerships on used equipment risk controls, inventory age limits, and underwriting standards that stress-tested for rate shocks. In trainings, he used his own line now, plain and unadorned. If the farm only works at peak prices and cheap credit, it does not work. Caleb Morris was the first proof that Hank's terms were not soft money but hard structure. Caleb finished the 5-year principal schedule on the combine without missing a December payment, then used the custom harvest savings to rebuild his own machinery sequence in stages instead of leaps. In 2022, he leased less and focused on better acres. In 2023, he bought back 40 acres at $4,200 per acre. Cash down plus a short fixed note, he retired in 30 months. By spring 2025, he was farming 280 acres with a debt service ratio under 18%, a 12-month operating reserve of $146,000, and a written rule taped inside his office cabinet. No variable debt on depreciating equipment. His net farm income averaged $92,400 across 2023 and 2024, not spectacular by coffee shop standards, but durable in bad weather and weak price windows. His wife, Dana, handled books every Tuesday night, and they stopped making decisions from urgency. Lena and Roy Whitfield followed a slower path, then a stronger one. Their $124,000 land contract to Hank never changed terms, not once, and the predictability mattered more than the discount. They paid the $15,500 annual principal on schedule, eliminated the last variable rate exposure within 2 years as required, and by 2024 they had 6 full months of household and farm overhead in liquid accounts. Their rebuilt 110-acre operation leaned into disciplined soybean corn rotation, lower machinery turnover, and pre-priced inputs only when basis and storage capacity justified it. Roy still welded in winter by choice, not survival. Lena turned their envelope system into a digital ledger with weekly reconciliations, and they used it to coach 2 younger couples at church who were heading toward the same debt trap they escaped. Their avoided interest and repricing fees over the full recovery period came in just above $74,000, and every dollar of that stayed local as repairs, wages, and taxes. Tomas Vega's recovery was the most fragile and then the most instructive. The $60,000 bridge note had bought him time, but his real turnaround came from obeying Hank's one line about principle before growth. He did not add cows when milk prices bumped up. He fixed contracts first. By late 2022, he had secured feed agreements with capped escalation clauses, replaced 2 high-failure cooling units from retained earnings, and reduced herd size to match labor and cash flow instead of ambition. In 2024, his dairy posted a net margin of 11.6% on lower gross volume, which would have sounded small in expansion years but meant full control of his books in volatile months. He repaid Hank early, then funded his own $38,000 contingency account, and has not drawn emergency credit since. Erin Dahl and Micah Sloan became the second wave of the same model. Erin finished her $28,500 overhaul contract 5 months ahead of schedule and converted the monthly $950 principal habit into a standing reserve transfer. By 2025, she was running 190 acres with no equipment note and had enough cash to buy a used sprayer package outright at a retirement sale. Micah cleared his $34,000 drying upgrade terms on time, cut post-harvest moisture discounts, and improved average pricing by storing and selling in disciplined windows instead of harvest pressure. Neither of them got large fast. Both got stable first. The multiplier became visible in county records, not speeches. From 2016 through 2025, Principal First zero-interest structures tied to Hank preserved or stabilized 914 acres across 5 recipient operations, avoided an estimated $213,000 in interest and fee drag, and prevented at least 3 likely distress sales based on projected cash deficits in weak commodity years. 1 old truck and 1 conservative balance sheet had turned into a local risk buffer that banks had not built and markets never offered. By then, the lesson had moved through shop floors, kitchen tables, and winter landlord meetings without needing a banner or a pitch. By the first week of March 2025, the roll call could be done cleanly, name by name, ledger by ledger. Hank Jennings held 740 debt-free acres, paid for grain storage, and conservative municipal holdings that together documented a net worth of $8,740,000. He still lived in the same farmhouse. He still capped personal spending. He still drove the 1979 Chevrolet C20, now at 402,000 miles, rust deeper at the fenders, seats still cracked, engine still starting in cold weather after 2 pumps, and a patient turn of the key. Caleb and Dana Morris were profitable, current and boring in the best possible way. Lena and Roy Whitfield were stable, on 110 acres. No variable rate exposure. No late notices. Tomas Vega ran a smaller dairy that stayed in the black through contract discipline. Erin Dahl expanded carefully, without mortgaging her future for speed. Micah Sloan improved margins through storage and timing, not debt. Earl Timmons stayed retired, sold 1 more small parcel to fund long-term care for his wife, and told anyone who asked that Hank had closed exactly the way he said he would, with a check and no delay. Wilbur Sykes passed away in 2019 at 88, and his daughters still received a holiday card from Hank each December with 1 line inside. "Your father gave me my first chance." Harold Pruitt, after losing ground years earlier, now ran parts at a regional shop and kept a paid-for 60 acres in hay and beans with his son. Martin Clary left hogs, drove bulk feed trucks for 6 years, then returned to a smaller finishing operation with fixed contracts and no variable machinery paper. None of them were treated as cautionary jokes. They were good operators who got caught in brutal timing, then rebuilt where they could. Kroll Ag Systems still operated on Route Z, just differently. The board shifted mix toward used inventory, cut teaser promotions, and required scenario disclosures showing payment stress at higher rates and lower commodity prices. First, Prairie Bank tightened collateral cross-linking language and expanded fixed-rate counseling after renewal meetings showed too many borrowers did not grasp reset risk. Those were quiet policy changes, but quiet changes keep farms alive. Hank formalized the Jennings Clear Title Fund with $1,500,000 and a hard annual cap of $75,000 per operating loan, 0 interest, principal first, budget audited quarterly. He did not hand out money on stories. He funded plans. By the end of 2025, the fund had issued 19 loans, all current, with 1 restructure and 0 foreclosures. The aggregate land base connected to those files was 2,140 acres. Estimated market value $11,980,000. held by families who might otherwise have sold under pressure. The county finally learned what Hank had written on an index card in 1986 and never stopped practicing. Wealth was not the new truck. Wealth was the clear title. Wealth was options in a bad year. Wealth was being able to help without asking permission from a lender. The man in worn overalls did not win an argument with speeches. He ran the numbers longer than everyone else, and when the cycle turned, the numbers spoke for him. Late that evening, after one more round of paperwork for the fund, Hank crossed the mudroom, opened the old metal file cabinet, and set another paid note into the drawer labeled Clear Titles. Outside, the 1979 Chevrolet rested in the lane under a yard light, rust and all, while families across Randolph County planned another season on ground they still owned. He left the drawer open for a moment and checked the tabs by hand, one finger on each label. Caleb Morris, Whitfield, Vega, Dahl, Sloan, Clear Title Fund, Year 1 through Year 5. Behind those folders sat the old artifacts that had started as private habits and ended as public proof. The 2006 auction notice flattened in a sheet protector. The blue ink receipt envelopes from the 2016 courthouse sale, and the index card from 1986 with corners, worn soft from being moved from the ledger to ledger. He closed the cabinet, turned off the mudroom light, and wrote one more line on the legal pad by the phone. Annual Reviews, Tuesday. By the second Tuesday of April 2026, 5 pickups and 1 livestock trailer were parked outside Hank's machine shed, and none of the pickups were new. Caleb arrived first with Dana and 2 binders of monthly cash flow reports. Lena and Roy carried a tin box of paid invoices and a spreadsheet printed in large type. Thomas brought feed contracts and cooling maintenance logs. Aaron and Micah came together, each with a 1-page budget and a reserve statement because Hank required both before coffee was poured. There was no speech, just arithmetic around a plywood table laid across sawhorses. Caleb's 2025 gross was $611,000, net $104,300, debt service $93,900 on short fixed notes only, ratio 15.4%. Dana pointed to a highlighted line and said, 12-month reserve now covers operating seed, chemical, and household. Hank nodded once and wrote compliant in the margin. Lena and Roy reported gross $284,000, net $71,200, no variable rate debt, land contract balance down to $15,500 with final payment scheduled in December. Roy set a cashier check stub on the table and said, last one this winter. Hank pushed it back. December. Keep liquidity through planting. Tomas laid out a thinner packet than in prior years, which was the best sign of all. Gross dairy revenue $1,040,000, net margin 12.1% after feed and energy, no emergency credit draws for 22 months. He had started a principal first reserve account for equipment failures. Balance $49,600. Aaron's 190 acres produced a gross of $402,300 with net $88,900 and no machinery note. Micah's drying upgrades had reduced discount losses by $18,400 in one season, and his storage timing added an average 37 cents per bushel across 61,000 bushels sold outside harvest pressure. Then the cascade showed itself. Caleb and Dana had advanced $22,000 interest-free to a beginning operator, Travis Menden, secured by a written repayment calendar and monthly reporting copied directly from Hank's forms. Lena and Roy had co-signed neither debt nor risk, But they had sold a used no-till drill to Marisol Kent for $4,800 payable in 8 principal-only installments with no fee. Tomas had extended 30-day feed terms to a neighbor during a processor delay and refused interest. Aaron and Micah jointly purchased a used nurse tank and shared it at cost with 2 younger renters. One discipline had become several. Quietly. If you are learning something from this, press like and share it with someone who still thinks a lower payment is always cheaper than a lower obligation. In July, Hank's accountant ran the multiplier ledger through year-end projections in front of the fund committee. The original $1,500,000 endowment had issued cumulative principal of $2,265,000 over rotating cycles without leverage, because repaid dollars were relent on strict terms. Weighted average loan size was $63,900. Delinquency over 30 days sat at 1.8%, cured within 1 quarter. Foreclosures were 0. Interest avoided by borrowers, compared with local conventional rates over equivalent terms, was estimated at $318,400 through mid-2026. Acres stabilized or retained in family operation reached 2,640 with a local value near $15,100,000. The committee chair, a retired teacher, read the totals twice and then set her glasses down without saying anything for a full 10 seconds. Dustin's resolution happened in a fluorescent training room at a dealership in Columbia, not at a podium and not for applause. By the first week of August 2026, he was running quarterly risk workshops for sales teams from 2 counties, 41 staff in folding chairs, sample contracts on the projector, coffee gone lukewarm by 9:30. He had replaced his old opener with a different one. "You are not paid to move iron," he told them. "You are paid to keep customers alive long enough to buy the next machine with retained earnings, not borrowed panic." He walked them through one anonymized case at 2.9%, teaser resetting to prime plus 3.25%, then stress-tested it at lower commodity prices and higher operating rates. Monthly payment moved from manageable to crushing in 24 months, exactly as he had once sold it. He did not hide that history. A younger salesperson asked whether conservative buyers were bad for commissions. Dustin answered, "Bad this quarter, better this decade." He now required every large proposal to include a downside page at 2 price shocks and 1 rate shock, signed by buyer and manager. He had become the person who interrupted momentum with caution, and the board kept him because defaults dropped. That same month, Hank received a phone call from First Prairie's regional office asking permission to use his contract template language for educational counseling. He said yes, with one condition: remove his name from the packet. The revised counseling binder was issued in September with a plain title, repayment structure options, and 1 sentence underlined twice. Compounding interest is a cost, not a strategy. By October 2026, the roll call still held. Hank was 70, net worth marked at $9,180,000 after land appreciation and conservative bond income. Still no personal debt. The 1979 Chevrolet C20 had crossed 409,300 miles. The rust on the fenders had spread. The bench seat was still cracked at the seam, and the odometer cable had been replaced once with a salvage part. It started after 2 pumps and a patient turn, same as before. The 1968 John Deere 4020 remained in service for auger and chore work, injector rebuild logged, hydraulic lines replaced, paid for 50 times over. The 9770 that had looked like a distressed liability in 2016 now sat maintained under cover, Ownership transferred cleanly, no liens. Earl Timmons passed away in late 2026 at 92, and his family settled the estate without dispute because the land sale records had been exact. Wilbur Sykes remained gone, and his daughters still got that December card. Harold Pruitt retired from the parts counter at 67, his son now running the paid-for 60 acres and adding 10 leased acres with no term machinery debt. Martin Clary kept his smaller finishing operation stable and finally replaced one barn fan system with cash from 2 retained years instead of a note. Dana began teaching monthly farm bookkeeping nights at church. Lena and Roy's final $15,500 payment cleared on December 3rd, and Hank filed their contract underpaid in full. Thomas hired one additional employee at market wages and did not expand herd size beyond his feed contract capacity. Aaron bought 20 adjoining acres for $96,000 with 40% down and a fixed 4-year note. Micah formed a grain marketing co-op with 3 neighbors using bylaws that banned variable debt on depreciating assets. No thread stayed loose. The bent thumbtack auction notice was archived, not discarded, because Hank wanted younger borrowers to see what a turning point looked like before it looked important. The receipt envelopes from 2016 remained in the file as cost bases for contracts now closed. The kitchen phone legal pads were boxed by year and moved to the upper shelf. Calls returned, terms documented, outcomes matched against promises. Even the line people once tossed at him about one breakdown deciding his future ended with an answer in plain numbers. Average annual repairs across the hardest decade, $14,980. Average annual interest paid on term debt, $0. Before we close, subscribe if you want more stories where arithmetic beats image. Comment with one rule you would write on your own index card, and share this with the person in your life who is being pushed into debt they do not need. Near dusk, on a cold evening in January 2027, Hank stood in the mudroom with boots still damp and opened the file cabinet one more time. Clear titles on the left, active principal schedules on the right. Paid notes centered in a stack that had grown thick enough to need a second divider. He checked the labels, shut the drawer, and switched off the light. Outside, the old Chevrolet waited in the lane under the same yard light, rusted and steady, while across Randolph County families penciled seed orders on tables they still owned, because one farmer chose clear titles over second mortgages, reserves over image and discipline, long enough for generosity to multiply.